At the beginning of the story, nothing appears urgent. On paper, the system looks functional. The United States is energy secure. Its refineries are modern, its financial system liquid, its global reach unmatched. Venezuela, meanwhile, sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, most of them heavy crude, difficult to refine, but extraordinarily abundant. For decades, the relationship between the two countries is not ideological, it is transactional. Tankers move quietly, payments clear, contracts renew. At the time, this arrangement feels stable. Few notice it as a strategic dependency. It is treated as geography, not policy. For most observers, the history of U.S.-Venezuela relations is told through leaders, speeches, elections, and sanctions. The narrative lens focuses on personalities and rhetoric. What is rarely discussed is the infrastructure beneath those headlines. Refineries calibrated for a specific type of oil, supply chains optimized over decades, financial flows structured around predictability rather than politics. The visible story is diplomatic tension. The invisible story is technical alignment. Heavy crude from Venezuela is not interchangeable with light shale oil. Refineries along the U.S. Gulf Coast were gradually configured, piece by piece, to process this specific grade efficiently. These were not dramatic decisions. They were capital expenditures approved by committees, justified by spreadsheets, amortized over decades. Each upgrade made economic sense on its own. Quietly, the system locked in. By the early 2000s, this alignment had become structural. Venezuela needed a buyer capable of refining its oil at scale. The United States needed a steady supplier that matched its refining capacity. The mechanism was not a treaty or a military pact. It was something more subtle. Industrial compatibility. At the time, it seemed logical. Few noticed the asymmetry forming. When oil prices rose, the relationship tightened. When they fell, it endured. Even political turbulence did not immediately disrupt it because the infrastructure remained. Pipelines do not vote. Refineries do not issue statements. They simply require feedstock. This is where most histories look away. They move forward to elections, sanctions, and public confrontations. But the critical question sits earlier and deeper. What happens when a global power builds part of its industrial system around a foreign resource it does not control? The answer does not arrive suddenly. It unfolds gradually. As Venezuela's internal economic management became more strained, oil exports remained the anchor. They were the one constant. Revenues flowed through a national oil company designed to be both commercial and political. On paper, it was sovereign. In practice, it was deeply entangled with foreign buyers, insurers, financiers, and refiners. The United States did not hold Venezuelan oil. It did not need to. Control in this context did not mean ownership. It meant leverage through compatibility, through payment systems, through shipping insurance, through refinery access, through the quiet assumption that Venezuelan crude, once extracted, would move along a path that had been engineered long before. This is the mechanism most narratives miss. It is not about ideology. It is about sunk costs. Once billions have been invested in infrastructure designed for a particular flow, changing that flow becomes expensive, slow, and politically complicated. Every alternative supplier requires adjustment. Every disruption carries domestic consequences. For Venezuela, the situation mirrored this dependency in reverse. Alternative buyers existed, but not at the same scale, not with the same logistical ease, and not with the same financial clearing systems. The oil could travel elsewhere, but the path was longer, more costly, and less predictable. On paper, both sides remained sovereign. In practice, their options narrowed. This is why the story does not begin with confrontation. It begins with alignment, with engineers, accountants, and shipping schedules, with decisions that solved immediate problems and postponed long-term questions. Years later, when political tensions rise and sanctions enter the conversation, the system does not collapse. It resists change. It strains, but it holds. Because it was not built for flexibility. It was built for efficiency, and efficiency, once optimized, becomes its own constraint. What looks, from the outside, like insistence or fixation is often something quieter. The difficulty of unwinding a system that was never designed to be unwound. At the time, no one framed it this way. Decades later, the structure is already in place. The story, from here on, is not about why pressure was applied, but why disengagement proved so difficult and so costly for both sides, long after the original logic had faded. For most of the 20th century, the energy story of the United States is told as one of abundance. Oil discoveries, expanding refineries, and later, technological breakthroughs that seemed to promise independence. In hindsight, this narrative is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. What it leaves out is specialization. Energy systems do not evolve toward flexibility. They evolve toward efficiency, and efficiency, quietly, rewards repetition. Once a refinery is tuned to a specific type of crude, every barrel that matches that specification lowers costs. Every barrel that does not raises them. Over time, this logic reshapes trade patterns more reliably than diplomacy ever could. Venezuelan crude was heavy, sulfur-rich, and difficult to process. But it was also consistent. That consistency mattered. It allowed refineries to be engineered not for variety, but for predictability. The Gulf Coast became a landscape of delayed coking units, hydrocrackers, and sulfur recovery systems. Each addition was justified individually. Together, they formed a system. At the time, it seemed logical. There was no single decision where dependence was chosen, no moment that could later be blamed. Instead, there were maintenance upgrades, expansions, efficiency gains. Each solved a problem that existed in the present. None were designed to anticipate a future rupture. This is the lens most histories miss. They search for motives in speeches and doctrines, when the real commitments were being written into steel and concrete. Once installed, these systems demanded utilization. Idle refineries are not neutral assets. They are liabilities. They create pressure, not policy. For Venezuela, this specialization created a mirror image. Its oil industry evolved to serve a buyer that could reliably absorb heavy crude at scale. Shipping routes shortened. Insurance costs stabilized. Payment mechanisms standardized. The oil sector became not just the backbone of the economy, but its organizing principle. On paper, diversification was discussed. In practice, concentration deepened. As years passed, the relationship became less visible precisely because it worked. Crude flowed. Fuel returned as refined products. Revenues entered government budgets. Few outside the industry had reason to scrutinize the arrangement. It was not dramatic. It was routine. Behind the scenes, however, options were narrowing. When alternatives were considered, they revealed hidden frictions. Retrofitting refineries for lighter crude required capital and downtime. Redirecting Venezuelan oil to distant markets introduced logistical uncertainty. Financing became more complex. Each alternative was possible. None were easy. This is how dependence forms without intent. By the time political narratives begin to dominate the headlines, the economic architecture is already mature. It does not respond quickly to shifts in tone. It responds to margins, throughput, and risk. Sanctions, when they appear, do not act on a blank slate. They act on a system that has been optimized for decades under different assumptions. Their effects are therefore uneven. Some actors absorb them. Others fracture. The system strains in places it was never reinforced. What looks like resolve, from the outside, often reflects something else. The difficulty of reversing decisions whose costs were deferred. For the United States, disengagement carried domestic implications. Refinery employment, fuel prices, regional economies. These were not abstract concerns. They were immediate. Policy, in this environment, did not operate freely. It navigated constraints inherited from earlier efficiencies. For Venezuela, the costs appeared differently. Revenue volatility, reduced access to clearing systems, rising transportation costs. None of these arrived all at once. They accumulated, quietly, gradually. At the time, the situation still seemed manageable. Oil continued to move, though less smoothly. Workarounds emerged. Intermediaries multiplied. Discounts widened. The system adapted, but each adaptation reduced transparency and increased friction. Rarely discussed is how long this process takes. Economic realignment does not follow electoral cycles. It unfolds over years, sometimes decades. During that time, both sides often continue to behave as if the old structure can be restored. This is not stubbornness. It is inertia. The infrastructure encourages it. The spreadsheets remember earlier margins. The facilities still exist. On paper, returning to the previous flow always looks cheaper than building something new. In hindsight, this hint of permanence is what made the relationship so difficult to unwind, not because either side lacked alternatives in theory, but because the system had been designed to make alternatives costly in practice. The story, up to this point, is not one of control or confrontation. It is one of alignment that outlasted its context, of systems that continued to operate long after the assumptions behind them had changed. Decades later, the consequences are still unfolding. As the system absorbed stress, it did what complex systems usually do. It adapted without announcing itself. Public attention remained fixed on statements, votes, and announcements. Meanwhile, a quieter process unfolded beneath the surface. Cargoes were rerouted. Ownership chains lengthened. Documentation became more layered. None of this altered the physical reality of oil extraction or refining. It merely changed how the flow was accounted for. At the time, these adjustments appeared temporary, stopgaps, technical responses to political weather. Few treated them as structural changes, but adaptation has a direction. Each additional intermediary introduced a margin. Each rerouting extended transit time. Each workaround reduced efficiency. What had once been a direct, optimized exchange became a longer sequence of compensations. The oil still moved, but the system paid more to move it. This mattered more than headlines suggested. For buyers accustomed to predictability, uncertainty became a cost. For sellers dependent on volume, discounts widened. The mechanism that had once minimized friction now multiplied it. Quietly, the economic logic shifted. The refining system did not disappear. It waited. Facilities designed for heavy crude still required heavy crude. When supply tightened or became irregular, operators faced choices that were not ideological but operational. Run below capacity, blend inputs, or seek alternatives that required recalibration. None were ideal. At the same time, Venezuelan production faced its own constraints. Heavy crude extraction depends on continuous investment, maintenance, diluents, spare parts. Interruptions did not halt output immediately. They degraded it gradually. Wells declined, infrastructure aged, recovery costs increased. On paper, reserves remained vast. In practice, accessibility narrowed. This is where time becomes the decisive factor. Economic systems can absorb shocks. What they struggle with is prolonged misalignment. Each year of suboptimal operation compounds earlier inefficiencies. Deferred maintenance becomes permanent loss. Temporary measures harden into routines. Years later, observers begin to ask why recovery is so slow, why output does not rebound when conditions ease, why trust does not return when agreements are revised. The answer often lies earlier, in periods that seemed merely transitional. Behind the scenes, financial institutions adjust risk models, insurers reprice exposure, shipping companies revise routes. None of these decisions are political. They are probabilistic. They reflect memory. Once risk is learned, it is not easily forgotten. This is why disengagement proved asymmetric. For the United States, the cost was measured in adjustment. For Venezuela, it was measured in erosion. One side could reconfigure with investment and time. The other needed both, while losing revenue. At the time, this imbalance was rarely articulated. The focus remained on immediate outcomes. Sanctions announced, licenses granted, exemptions debated, but the deeper process continued independently. Control, in this phase, was no longer the central issue. Persistence was. The system persisted in a degraded form, sustained by workarounds that prevented collapse but not decline. Each workaround solved a present problem and introduced a future one. Transparency diminished. Transaction costs rose. Predictability faded. This is not unusual. It is characteristic of systems operating beyond their design assumptions. What makes this case distinctive is how long the original alignment had lasted. Decades of efficiency created expectations that survived their conditions. Planners, traders, and policymakers continued to reference a baseline that no longer existed. In hindsight, the question shifts. It is no longer why pressure was applied or why resistance emerged. It is why so much effort went into preserving a structure whose economic logic had already weakened. The answer lies in sunk costs, institutional memory, and the difficulty of admitting that optimization can become a trap. For Venezuela, the trap was concentration. For the United States, it was specialization. Both were rational when adopted. Neither was designed for sudden reversal, and neither side could fully disengage without absorbing losses that were politically and economically uncomfortable. This is why the story resists clean endings. Even as trade volumes fluctuate and policies adjust, the underlying architecture continues to exert influence. Decisions made quietly in the late 20th century still shape options in the 21st. The system no longer operates at peak efficiency, but it has not been replaced. Replacement would require something more disruptive than tension. It would require reconstruction. Years later, discussions of energy transition and diversification emerge. They promise flexibility, resilience, independence. But transitions, like dependencies, unfold slowly. They inherit the constraints of what came before. The past does not vanish when a new policy is announced. It lingers in pipelines, contracts, and balance sheets. This is the deeper reason disengagement remained incomplete. Not because letting go was impossible, but because the cost of letting go had been deferred for too long. The next phase of the story does not begin with confrontation. It begins with accounting. By the time attention turns to numbers, much of the outcome is already set. Accounting rarely feels dramatic, but it is often decisive. Years after the original alignment, the relationship between oil producer and refinery consumer no longer revolves around expansion or growth. It revolves around impairment. Assets are reviewed, assumptions are revised, forecasts are quietly adjusted downward. This is where the mechanism reveals its final shape. Infrastructure built for a specific flow carries value only as long as that flow is expected to continue. When uncertainty becomes permanent, the question shifts from utilization to write-downs. Not immediately, gradually, one revision at a time. At the time, these changes do not attract attention. They appear in footnotes, in revised depreciation schedules, in lower long-term projections that few outside the industry read closely. Yet they shape behavior more reliably than public declarations. Refineries begin to hedge their expectations. Capital expenditures are delayed. Upgrades are reconsidered. Flexibility becomes desirable, but flexibility costs money. And money, in this phase, is already constrained. For Venezuela, the accounting pressure arrives faster and more visibly. Oil revenues underpin fiscal planning. When they become volatile, budgets follow. Maintenance competes with social spending. Investment is postponed not because it is unnecessary, but because it is unaffordable in the short term. On paper, this appears manageable. In practice, it compounds. Deferred investment in heavy crude systems does not pause decline. It accelerates it. Output drops slowly, then more quickly. Recovery costs rise with each year of delay. What once required upkeep now requires reconstruction. This is the quiet point of no return, not a collapse, not a crisis moment, a threshold where restoring the old system becomes more expensive than building a new one. Yet building a new one remains out of reach. For the United States, the accounting logic moves differently. Refining capacity is diversified incrementally. Imports adjust. Domestic production fills some gaps. None of this is seamless, but it is spread across firms, regions, and time. Losses are absorbed unevenly, often invisibly. This asymmetry matters. It explains why disengagement can appear deliberate on one side and chaotic on the other, even when neither is fully in control. Systems with diversified revenue absorb shocks quietly. Systems concentrated on a single flow feel every disruption. At the time, policymakers still speak in terms of leverage and pressure. But beneath that language, firms are responding to spreadsheets. When risk-adjusted returns no longer justify exposure, they exit. Not publicly, gradually. Insurance coverage tightens. Financing shortens in duration. Payment terms harden. None of this requires coordination. It emerges from shared models and similar incentives. This is how disengagement proceeds without announcement. The oil continues to move, but at a discount, through longer routes, with more intermediaries. Each step reduces net revenue and increases uncertainty. The flow remains visible, yet its economic weight diminishes. Years later, observers ask why the relationship still matters if volumes have fallen. The answer lies in residual dependence. Even diminished flows can anchor systems that have not yet been replaced. Partial reliance is often harder to manage than full reliance or full separation. On paper, diversification strategies appear advanced. In reality, transition remains incomplete. This is the paradox of long-built systems. They persist not because they are optimal, but because replacing them requires coordination, capital, and time simultaneously. Few actors possess all three when margins are shrinking. In hindsight, the cost was not only economic, it was temporal. Time spent sustaining a degrading system was time not spent building alternatives. Each year of delay narrowed future options. Yet at no point did the situation feel like a clear choice. It felt like a series of reasonable deferrals. This is why the story resists moral framing. There is no single decision to isolate, no dramatic pivot, only accumulation, quiet, rational, and difficult to reverse. By the late stages, the question is no longer whether to disengage, but how to manage what remains. Legacy contracts, stranded assets, political expectations shaped by past realities. The relationship becomes less about oil itself and more about the residue of oil, infrastructure, debt, employment, and institutional memory. Decades earlier, the alignment was built to reduce risk. Decades later, it defines it. The final realization arrives slowly, not in speeches, but in balance sheets that no longer reference restoration. They reference mitigation. They assume loss as a baseline. This is the real constraint, not ideology, not confrontation, but the long shadow of systems optimized for a world that no longer exists. The next section does not resolve the story. It places it in time. Years later, the story is no longer told in real time. It is told in intervals. Annual reports replace emergency meetings. Long-term scenarios replace short-term fixes. The language becomes calmer, not because the problem has been solved, but because it has been absorbed into expectations. This is how large economic relationships end. Not with rupture, but with normalization of decline. For the United States, the oil system gradually reorients, not dramatically, not all at once. Refining configurations adjust, imports diversify, some facilities close, others adapt. The process is uneven, but it is distributed. Losses are spread across firms, regions, and years. What matters is not the speed of change, but its direction. The system no longer assumes a return to the old flow. It plans without it. For Venezuela, the timeline feels different. The same years carry more weight. Decline is not spread thin. It concentrates. Production capacity lost is not easily regained. Expertise leaves. Infrastructure ages past maintenance into obsolescence. On paper, the reserves remain. In practice, time has altered their meaning. This is where hindsight clarifies what was invisible at the beginning. The relationship was never about holding or letting go. It was about whether a system built for a specific purpose could survive once that purpose faded. Few systems do. The oil continued to flow long enough to mask the transition. That is why the ending feels ambiguous. There is no single date to mark disengagement, no treaty that signals closure, only a gradual shift from centrality to residual relevance. Decades earlier, the alignment had reduced uncertainty. Decades later, it preserved it. The cost, ultimately, was not paid in one currency. It appeared as stranded assets, delayed transitions, foregone alternatives. It appeared as years spent maintaining compatibility instead of building flexibility. At the time, none of this felt like a mistake. Each decision addressed an immediate need. Each deferral bought time. The future consequences were abstract, discounted by distance. This is the quiet logic of economic history. The most influential choices rarely announce themselves as such. They arrive disguised as efficiency, as optimization, as sensible alignment with existing conditions. Only later does their cumulative weight become visible. By the time the global conversation turns fully toward new energy systems, the old relationship still casts a shadow, not because it dominates volumes, but because it shaped trajectories. It determined where capital flowed, which skills were cultivated, which alternatives were postponed. Transitions do not start from zero. They start from wherever the previous system left them. This is why letting go was never a single act. It was a long process of recalibration, constrained by decisions made when the world looked different. The inability to disengage quickly was not a failure of will. It was a feature of systems designed for stability, not reversal. In the end, the real reason the relationship endured was not strategic obsession or ideological fixation. It was inertia embedded in infrastructure, finance, and expectation. The oil relationship did not end when politics changed. It ended when accounting assumptions did. The war of narratives moved faster than the movement of steel, capital, and habit. And so the system lingered, long after its original logic had expired. The last tankers did not mark the end. The last depreciation schedule did. The 20th century oil system did not disappear in a moment. It receded, quietly, gradually, leaving behind lessons that are easy to miss and difficult to repeat. The reserves were counted for generations. The costs unfolded over decades.